Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to the Global Talks International Webinar with the titles PRC, People's Republic of China, Turn 73, Issues and Challenges for Asia and the World, organized by CSEAS Indonesia. Welcome again to this Global Talks. My name is Asep from University of Muhammadiyah Jakarta. Will be a moderator for next 2.5 hours. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming, for joining with this conference. We have distinguished speakers already, and let's have some introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, as we know, 1st of October, exactly 72 years ago, Chinese Communist Party Chairman Mao Zedong proclaimed the establishment of the PRC in Beijing. Now, under the principle of peaceful rise and coexistence, China's gross domestic product had been surged from 360 billion in 1990, becoming 1 trillion in 1998, and in 2010, 6 trillion. And today, China is the second largest economy in the world with estimated GDP 20 trillion US dollars. Likewise, it emerged as the giant global trade with 6 trillion, with 3 trillion export and 2021. It is world biggest foreign exchange reserves, about 3 trillion as end of August 2020. And now this become biggest creditor to many countries, and in the same time become the third strongest military force in the world. Now we are going to discuss the challenges and problems faced by Asia and the world, and also to discuss the CPC policy in Xinjiang, Tibet, and Hong Kong. We should have in discussion also satellite of tension, South China Sea and China aggressive behavior toward India, Japan, Australia, and also to discuss the challenges, the implication of ASEAN growing dependence on China, and to explore China's debt trap diplomacy. Now we have four speakers, distinguished speaker, hopefully 5, I think. Welcome. First, Professor Robert Blackman, welcome. Join the seminar, and also I have understand Lieutenant General Sokin Chauhan is already in the forum, and Professor Carly Thayer, welcome, Professor from Australia, and Mr. Kalpit Manikar from New Delhi, welcome to join us. And the last speaker will be Mr. Faramal Anjaya from Jakarta. Please allow me to request Professor Robert Blackman as a first speaker, and I would like to introduce first with the short biography. Let me have a read for the audience now. As you know, Dr. Robert Blackman is Emeritus Professor, Faculty of Law, Head of Ocean Law and Policy Program, Center for International Law, National University of Singapore, and Mr. Robert Blackman, also Adjunct Senior Fellow in Maritime Security Program and at the Institute for Defense and Strategic Studies of the Rajaratnam School of International Studies, NTU. He was the founding director of Center for International Law, CIL, a University Level Research Center at the National University of Singapore. And Professor served as its director from 2009 to 2016, and is currently the head of its Ocean Law and Policy Program. So welcome, Professor Robert Beck, to present your time.
Thank you very much. It's my honor to be invited to participate in what looks like a very interesting discussion. Allow me, I have slides, allow me to attempt to share them, and hopefully this will okay, can you see the slides all right?
Yeah, yes.
All right, good. I'm going to focus upon a rather narrow issue. My expertise is law of the sea, particularly the 1982 convention. So I will be focusing on the topic of China and the law of the sea, perhaps provide some background to some of the issues that will be discussed by the other speakers. outline of my presentation, I'm going to first look at the importance of geography to the China, then some unresolved sovereignty disputes and maritime boundaries, which is a source of much of the tension in East Asia and Southeast Asia. Then a look at China and the Law of the Sea Convention, and then a little bit on China and the South China Sea, particularly as the dispute arose. Now, part one, the importance of geography. Geography in 1982 UNCLOS. Passage regimes in UNCLOS are critically important to China's economic and security interests. Transit passage through straits used for international navigation is critically important to China. Straits like the Straits of Malacca and Singapore, as well as archipelagic sea lanes passage through Indonesian archipelagic waters, and innocent passage through the territorial sea of their neighbors. Now, if you simply look at this map, you'll see that historically China viewed the threats to its sovereignty from land territory, not from the oceans. And you see the Great Wall was built because it was the hordes from Mongolia that they considered a threat. For many periods, they closed off shipping. But if you take a look now, you'll see the southern coast of China moving from Dalian down to Hong Kong and Macau. If you take a look at the importance of this map, you'll see the importance of the sea lanes, because it's not possible for Chinese trade and Chinese naval vessels to go from China to the Indian Ocean unless they pass through choke points in Southeast Asia. They must either, the normal route is through the Straits of Malacca and Singapore, where they must pass through the waters of those three countries. The other routes would be through the Indonesian archipelago. And if you take a look, we'll show later that if they want to trade up to even out to the Pacific, they have to go through straits or choke points in the waters of Japan or Korea, or if they want to go north to the Arctic or the Arctic Passage, they must go through choke points controlled by Russian Federation. So in effect, China has a similar interest to the law of the sea for naval powers that the two superpowers at the time the law of the sea was negotiated, the USSR and the USA, insisted upon. This, of course, is the Indonesia's maritime zones, and it's through the Indonesian archipelago that the choke points exist, either up through the South China Sea and then up through the Straits of Malacca, or here through Sunda, or down here through Lombok. And it gets show this again. If they don't go through these choke points, they must go all around Australia, which is a significant increase in time and fuel. And even China's moved to the north. If they're going to go through Dalian, they have to be going through waters controlled by Japan and Korea, or up here controlled by Soviet Union and Japan. And then Soviet Union through up here through the Bering Strait. So the message is China is a coastal state, but it is highly dependent on the passage regimes that are in 1982 UNCLOS. I always tell my students, if I were China, I'd write a thank you note to the negotiators from USA and USSR that ensured that passage regimes were included in the convention. That's again the first island, second island chain in terms of China's defense. Now, another way to look at the China and law of the sea is to look at the importance of the unresolved sovereignty disputes and maritime boundaries. A lot of this results from the fact that at the end of World War II, the peace treaties with Japan and the Western powers did not clearly indicate who was going to get sovereignty over islands that had been occupied by Vietnam. I'm sorry, by Japan prior to World War II. First and foremost, you have the Taiwan Strait, which is off the coast of China, very close. It ranges from 130 nautical miles, I think, to 180. And then you have over on the right, you have to the north, you have Pratas Island, which is occupied by Taiwan, but also claimed by China. You have over the Paracel Islands, which are occupied by China, but also claimed by Vietnam. You have Scarborough Shoal, which was a center for, which is off the coast of the Philippines, but it has been now basically under the control of China, and it was one of the sources of the arbitration award. And then down here you have the more complex Spratly Islands, which are occupied by at least 5 different countries and claimed by them. So it's these sovereignty disputes which were never resolved, which has been one of the serious sources of tension. And there's in the north, it's the same thing with the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, between which are occupied by Japan, but claimed by China. They're only 170 nautical kilometers from Taipei. They're close to the 170 kilometers from the closest other Japanese island, etc. There arguably one issue would be, are there rocks or islands? But the key from the source of tension between China and Japan is who has sovereignty over these islands. You have air defense zones claimed by countries. Japan's is the dark blue line going up, complicated. China is the most recent to claim one, the red line. But you also have one claimed by Korea up here. And there's an area where 3 of them almost overlap. You have gas and oil fields here, which are a sensitive issue, right through the middle of the economic zone claim of Japan. So again, the island sovereignty over those islands, the disputed islands, is significant because it could also affect the claims to the resources. End of World War II and South China Sea Islands, the sovereignty issues at the end of World War II. None of the Japanese held islands were occupied in the South China Sea at the end of World War II. 1947, Republic of China and France attempted to reclaim the Paracel Islands, which is up here on the left. 1947, the ROC issued a location map of the South China Sea Islands. This is on the left. And then the Paracel Islands, France announced annexation in 1932. Japan occupied some of them during World War II. After World War II, the PRC occupied Woody Island in one group, and France and Vietnam occupied the Crescent Group, which is down to the south. 1974, China used force to assume control over all of the islands, but they're still very clearly claimed by Vietnam. Vietnam still maintains it has the strongest sovereignty claim. The occupation of the Spratly Islands after World War II, France and China had historic claims to the island. Japan and French Indochina occupied the islands during World War II. ROC claimed the islands in 1946 and has occupied the largest Ituaba or Taiping since 56, I believe. Philippine Claim is based on an individual, Thomas Clomo, who claimed the island under the title of Freedom Land. Vietnam claimed the island's sovereignty over them through the French claim. President Marcos then picked up that claim in 1971. As the law of the sea was negotiated and economic zone was debated, it looked like it was going to come into force as the states began to occupy the islands which previously had not been occupied. So Vietnam, Philippines, Malaysia occupied almost all of the larger features in the 70s and early 80s. China in the late 80s began to occupy islands, including Johnson South Reef after a military confrontation with Vietnam, and then it occupied Mischief Reef, the last one in 1995, which is right off the coast of the Philippines. And many of the islands have been expanded through reclamation and militarized. So here's the sketch of the islands. Those in green are occupied by the Philippines. Those in purple are occupied by Vietnam. They actually occupy the largest number. China occupies those are in red. Ituaba, dark blue, slightly different in the middle of the screen, is occupied still by Taiwan. And then down to the south, the ones in yellow were occupied by Malaysia. Many of them have small garrisons on, and many of them have other facilities. So again, the location of the Spratlys is down here. The so-called Kalianan claim or Freedom Land claim is this polygon shape there, which doesn't include all of the Spratly Islands, but Philippine claim is to those. And then Brunei arguably claims one down here. Scarborough Shoal is claimed by Vietnam and Taiwan and China and Philippines. It's very close to the Philippines. There's one bank up here that is actually submerged and not subject to a claim of sovereignty, but China also claims sovereignty over that. And then there's the Paracel Islands up here and Pratas up there. So again, the law of the sea does not address the issue of who has sovereignty over islands. It's the law of the sea says which maritime zones you can claim from land territory, including islands. But it assumes that we know who owns the land territory. And this is part of the underlying problem in the South China Sea as well as in the East China Sea. Paracel Islands, the Pratas, Scarborough Shoal, Macclesfield Bank, which is there, and then the Spratlys, which are the most complicated. The militarization of the disputed features. There's no rule of international law that I'm aware of that says a state cannot militarize disputed territory that it occupies. Tribunal in South China Sea case did not rule that China's militarization of the islands was contrary to UNCLOS or general international law. The press often gets that wrong. What the tribunal did rule was that China's method of reclamation and island buildings were in violation of their obligations to protect and preserve the marine environment. But island building in principle and putting facilities on an island, the law of the sea is silent on that issue. Mischief Reef, when China began to occupy in the early late 80s, it built a little hut for fishermen, then expanded that hut, then down to the left, expanded even more. And today you see after the 90s, you have airstrips and many other facilities. Similarly, you look at Subi Reef. It used to be just a reef. Now it has airstrips, etc. Fiery Cross Reef, which is the closest to the sea lanes. Again, and this is another view of Mischief Reef. So there has been serious development of the features. And now, strategic balance from a perhaps Chinese perspective, they would look at the US military, and they would look at the US bases in South Korea and in Japan, and over here in Guam, look at the US link with the Philippines, the use of bases in Singapore, and then down to Australia. So from a Chinese perspective, they might view that their coastline is actually surrounded by potential adversary forces. From the Southeast Asian perspective, of course, the militarization is a threat to peace and stability in the South China Sea. You have the Chinese militarization, you have the main submarine base on Hainan, but then you have militarization in Woody Island and in several of the Spratly Islands, so that the sea lanes through that major sea lane is perhaps now Chinese has a great deal of influence over it. Now, China and the Law of the Sea Convention. The PRC is a member of the UN, permanent member of the Security Council. You may recall back the Republic of China and Taiwan joined the UN and took the UN seat in 1945. But the Civil War ended in 1949. The Republic of China moved to Taiwan. And ROC continued to represent China at the UN until 1971. And then following US and China normalization of relations after Nixon's visit, PRC was officially represented China at the UN and in the UN Security Council. Now, this is 1 year before the Law of the Sea negotiations leading to the '82 convention began. China participated in the negotiations for 9 years, from '73 to '82. China participated in the 9 years of negotiations. The idea that this was created by the Western countries without the developing countries or China is total nonsense. There were 128 developers. The group of 77 numbered at the time, I think, over 120. China supported the positions of the group of 77 against what it referred to as the Western hegemonic powers. China supported the group of 77 position on the economic zone concept and on the position that coastal states should have sovereign rights to the natural resources in the economic zone, and that historic fishing rights should not be recognized. Remember, you may recall at the time the largest long-distance fishing country was Japan. China in 1982 UNCLOS, it signed the convention when it was adopted in December '82. It ratified the convention in 1996 after the deep seabed provisions were amended in '94. China formally declared strait baselines along its mainland coast and around the Paracel Islands in the South China Sea. Some states objected to the baselines as contrary to the provisions on strait baselines in UNCLOS. China, like many states, made a declaration under Article 298. The general principle is you must accept compulsory dispute settlement for any dispute with another state party. But Article 298 allows you to opt out of the dispute settlement for certain categories of disputes. And China exercised its right to opt out on all disputes concerning interpretation or application of the provisions relating to boundary delimitations of territorial sea, economic zone, and outer and continental shelf, as well as disputes on historic bays or titles. And disputes concerning military activities at sea. China has opted out of that dispute settlement on those provisions as well. My main point on this is, as a rising naval power, China has the same interests in the law of the sea that the US and the USSR had during the negotiations. China is becoming a major economic and military power with global maritime interests and a large navy. So its navy will want the same freedoms to use the ocean for military purposes that the US and USSR did when UNCLOS was negotiated. Therefore, one could argue that it's China's national interest to support rather than challenge the legal regime set out in the 1982 convention. Provisions in UNCLOS on passage rights are critically important to UNCLOS or to China because its coasts are blocked by island chains. China has also been a major participant in all the UN organs established under the law of the sea. It's had a judge as a member of the International Tribunal for Law of the Sea, has a member on the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf, has a seat on the Council of the International Seabed Authorities. Chinese contractors have contracts for the exploration of deep sea minerals. So China has benefited and taken part in all of the legal regime established under the law of the sea. Now, China and the South China Sea, I'll give a little background, and Carl follows this more closely than I do. I'm sure he'll have much to say. Resource zones under UNCLOS provides coastal states insisted that they wanted a 200-mile economic zone. And the law of the sea now provides that, gives them sovereign rights. out to 200 nautical miles. One of the problems was Article 21 created an exception for the maritime zones around islands. It's one of the arguably the most badly drafted provisions in the convention, has been a source of controversy in several cases. The general rule is that islands are entitled to the same maritime zones as other land territory, as long as they're naturally formed areas of land above water at high tide. But there's one exception, which again, they couldn't reach agreement on more precise or clear language. It says rocks which cannot sustain human habitation or economic life of their own shall have no economic zone. Actually, it says or continental shelf of their own. In other words, if it's only a rock, it's entitled to a 12 nautical mile territorial sea, but no resource zones, no economic zone, and no continental shelf. In other words, they're only entitled to 12 nautical miles. Now, although all of the states bordering the South China Sea became parties to UNCLOS in the early 90s and claimed an EEZ, they did not clarify whether they were claiming an EEZ from any of the islands in the South China Sea. In other words, in principle, everybody knew there were these disputed islands, but none of the states were clarifying whether or not they were claiming an economic zone from any of the Spratly Islands, which they either claimed or occupied. That was true in the case of Vietnam, Philippines, Malaysia, and Brunei, as well as China and Taiwan. 1982 convention provides that states may claim an economic zone extending to 200 miles from the baselines. In addition, states with a broad shelf can claim an extended continental shelf out to the outer edge of their continental margin, which can extend to 350 nautical miles or even beyond 350 nautical miles if they are blessed with a broad shelf. But to claim an extended continental shelf, states must submit technical information to a body established by the convention called the Commission on Limits of the Continental Shelf, or CLCS. CLCS advised all parties to UNCLOS if they intended to claim an extended continental shelf, they were required to submit information to the CLCS by May 2009. What this deadline did was it forced the states bordering the South China Sea to indicate whether they were claiming an EEZ from any of the disputed islands, the disputed Spratly Islands in particular, because before this, it was not clear. Now, again, it's the same baseline from which you measure your economic zones. You get an automatic 12-mile territorial sea where you have sovereignty over the airspace and the water and the subsoil. Then from 12 to 200, you have the economic zone where you have right to the resources in the water and under the water. And if you're blessed with a broad shelf, it might, for water, it's high seas beginning at 200, but you can claim an extended shelf out to the outer edge of the continental margin. And there you get the hydrocarbons and the minerals, basically. Now, coming back to the deadline. Meeting the deadline, Malaysia and Vietnam submitted information to the CLCS, a joint submission saying, we are claiming an extended continental shelf together in this area. And to do that, they showed for the first time where their 200-mile economic zone limit was. And this was there's another separate claim of Vietnam, a separate submission, which showed where its 200-mile limit was, and it was claiming an extended shelf beyond that. Although they did not take part in this joint submission, these two countries, Vietnam and Malaysia, also indicated where they believed the economic zone of the Philippines would be. This is critically important because what it meant is if this were accepted, all of the fisheries resources, hydrocarbons, and minerals would belong to the coastal states in the southern part of the South China Sea, because China is far too north, much far too north. Now take a look. This was 6 May 2009. The very next day, China submitted a note verbal to the UN Secretary General, officially objecting to that joint submission of Malaysia and Vietnam and the separate submission of Vietnam. And key importance here, China has indisputable sovereignty over the islands in the South China Sea, without explaining which islands. And the adjacent waters could be territorial sea, and you would have a sovereignty over the territorial sea, if that's what they meant. But then they have the words here, and enjoys sovereign rights and jurisdiction over the relevant waters. Sovereign rights and jurisdiction is a term used for economic zone and continental shelf. Relevant waters is not a legal term of art. We don't know what that meant, as well as the seabed and subsoil. So they're saying they have sovereign rights over, let's say, fisheries, as well as oil and gas and minerals. And then at the end it says see attached map. And then for the first time, the PRC put forward to the international community what has now become the infamous 9-line map with the Pratas Islands, the Paracel Islands, Macclesfield Bank, as well as Scarborough Shoal, and then the South China Sea Islands. And this has been the source of tension primarily in the South China Sea. Came to the South China Sea award of the tribunal, jumped to the conclusion in 2016. What the tribunal ruled was none of the disputed islands in the Spratlys was an island entitled to an economic zone. All those with a white and circle around them were above what naturally formed areas of land above water at high tide, entitled to a 12-mile territorial sea. But the tribunal in effect said the information available to it, these are all rocks, they get a 12-mile territorial sea. That's the disputed areas. But otherwise, the pink area would belong to the Philippines of economic zone of the Philippines, or here the economic zone of Malaysia, and a major beneficiary would be Vietnam, because there's only a couple little islands on the outer edge of Vietnam's economic zone claim. But otherwise, all the waters off the Vietnamese coast, the fisheries as well as the hydrocarbons would belong to Vietnam. This also raises an issue for Vietnam, for Indonesia, because your Natuna Islands come up here, you claim your territorial sea of 12 miles, you have a continental shelf boundaries with Vietnam and Malaysia, but you also claim an economic zone out here. But the Chinese 9-line map cuts through your economic zone and your outer continental shelf. So that brings Indonesia into the picture, even though they don't claim any of the disputed islands. China's claim to resources is also in conflict with it. These are the islands that are claimed by China. And this is another picture down here showing the effect of this outer continental shelf claims triggered the dispute with China, because they would never be entitled to any of this unless they make a claim from the islands, or a claim which they seem to be making from the 9-line map. China agreed to the compulsory dispute settlement procedures when it ratified the convention, could have challenged the jurisdiction of the tribunal if it believed the Philippines raised issues outside jurisdiction, but it refused to participate in the case. And therefore, the Philippines exercised its right to request the tribunal, appoint the remaining arbitrators, and proceed. And that's what they did. But China also made its position on some of the issues known to the tribunal through its embassy in The Hague. And the award of the tribunal in 2016 is final and binding on the parties, which are China and Philippines, legally final and binding. But of course, like all other international courts and tribunals, they have no army and no policemen, and they can't go anywhere to enforce the award. Okay, just 3 slides left. Sorry for taking so much time. Although China's declared the award null and void, it's undertaking extensive lawfare campaign to criticize the award and every point made by the tribunal on jurisdiction and on the merits. It's criticized the reasoning. which in my view is a message that China is taking the law of the sea very seriously. It knows it lost the case, but it has its scholars studying every line and reasoning in the judgment in an attempt to justify its position of declaring the decision null and void. Now, official statements after it is they seem to be employing the straight baselines around the island groups, or the so-called four Sha in the South China Sea. My own view on this is that contrary to the Law of the Sea Convention, the Law of the Sea says, except where otherwise provided in this convention, the normal baseline's low water line along the coast. There's an exception for archipelagic states like Indonesia and Philippines, permitting them to draw straight baselines around outermost points of their islands and drying reefs. But there's no exception for continental states with mid-ocean archipelagos like US with Hawaii to claim straight baselines around the mid-ocean archipelago. And the US State Department in their lawfare with the United China has recently provided a detailed study of China's maritime claims, as well as an appendix showing the practice of other states, in which it says if China is claiming baselines around the four Sha, this would be contrary to UNCLOS. China might be trying to claim around these islands, for example, the Spratlys, and the US geographers are saying at the most China could claim would be those circles here. Again, this is subject to debate. I'm sure China would not agree. Okay, thanks for your attention. Happy to take questions later.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Robert Blackman, speaking from Singapore, and very extensive explanation of the regarding UN clause application to the area, and this is reminding also dispute in depth in this area, so China Sea particularly. Let's go to next speaker, Mr. from New Delhi, Lieutenant General Sokin Chowdhury is with us already. I would like to introduce the, I believe, Lieutenant General Sokin Chowdhury has already in the room, and then I would like to introduce a short of the biography of Lieutenant General Sokin Chowdhury, who was the chairman of the ceasefire monitoring group in August 2018. He was Director General of Assam Rifles, India's oldest and largest paramilitary force. And he has had several key appointments during his long career in Army. And he has also past experience at military diplomacy, since he was the defense attaché in the Indian embassy in Nepal for 3.5 years. And also, Lieutenant General Sokin Chowdhury has a PhD degree in international relations and defense studies from Punjab University, Chandigarh. Please welcome Lieutenant General Sokin Chowdhury, speaking from New Delhi. Thank you very much, sir, for joining the international seminar. Time is yours.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Can you hear me properly?
Yeah.
Yes, clear.
Yeah.
Okay. So we've had such a brilliant exposition of the Chinese claim lines along the Pacific Ocean, along the South China Sea. But let me give you another perspective, a perspective from India. Being a soldier and having commanded my brigade and my division along the line of active control in the Ladakh areas, but in the Ladakh area, which is in many ways a disputed area between us and China. And that dispute over the last couple of years, especially, seems to have sort of escalated, because China has decided that international agreements be damned. We've got to sort of push our claim lines, ensure that we get through to whatever we want, and push it as far as we can. And maybe then the international community will agree to what China is saying. So much has been said about how China's rapidly growing economy has led to increasing power disparity between India and China over the last 2 decades. China's economic growth, no doubt, has been spectacular, but it's not really clear uh, whether that gives a good sense of how effective its military capabilities are against my country, India. We've had a problem with China in the area of Galwan 2 years ago, where in a primitive show of strength, both the Indian and Chinese armies decided that weapons be damned. We would use clubs instead. And the Chinese attacked the Indians, and the Indians had to retaliate, with the Indians losing about 20 soldiers, including their commanding officer. And as far as we know, and as far as our soldiers have told us, that China had lost up to 42 of their soldiers, but China has claimed that only 3 of the soldiers died. So, but that's normal of China's double speak in these issues. So let me just talk about the nature of India's power disparity between India and China. There is significant asymmetry between India and China. The asymmetry, though, is not as overwhelming as it used to be. If we were to consider certain facets of war-making capacity, such as capital intensiveness of the military mobilization, extractive capability of the state, and institutional capacities to mobilize forces on a large scale. In this recent standoff between India and China, India has been able to mirror the Chinese PLA deployment along the line of actual control 100%, in the sense that whatever China has placed against India along a line of actual control, we have been able to mirror that and bring in some more troops. So if there is assessed disparity between us, that disparity is not in the area where China or India might plan a conflict. That's something that I want to make very clear. If you look at geography and the areas of disparity between India and China are the areas along the McMahon line, that is in the northeast Himalayan region, where we had accepted, or maybe not really accepted, but at least we had signed an agreement with Tibet. And this area is actually borders Tibet and not China. It is the Chinese annexation of Tibet, which is entirely illegal, that now makes them a party to this problem. So in the area of the Northeast Mountains, where we have a problem along the line of actual control with China, China does not have any distinctive military advantages. She may claim whatever lines she wants to claim, but if China was to bring in her forces, there would be no significant capability of the Chinese to launch any kind of military action against the Indians. Now, if we go north, where there is a continuing standoff over the last 2 years with China, once again, while China has been able to bring in a large number of forces, almost 5 motorized divisions, the entire Tibet command, they have been able to array against India. But we found that while dealing with Chinese at a super high altitude level, that is where we are deployed in the areas of Ladakh, eastern Ladakh, the areas of Rezangla, the areas of the Pangong Pass, where ordinarily the temperatures are -10, -15. The height is between 15,600 to 17,600. We found the PLA not very capable of staying there, and therefore Chinese have started the process of quick rotation of its troops. But even during this quick rotation of troops, we found the Chinese having a significantly larger problem dealing with the health of the PLA. There's a marked reluctance of the PLA to engage the Indian troops. While I have personally found, since I've been a commander there, the Chinese, that PLA, wants to bully you, wants to push its way through, but most of the time they have been unable to push us through, and we have not come worse in any physical encounter that we've had with the PLA. So let's just sort of see where the advantage of China lies. Does it lie in the resources? Does it lie in modern weapons? Does it lie in their ability, in their cyber ability? Does it lie in their ability to win a war? As military men, we look at their war winning capability. We've seen the recent the recent campaign of the Russians against Ukraine, and realized that there is something called a perceived strength, and there's something called a final capable strength. And the Russian army has come out much worse in Ukraine, mainly because they were unable to, unable to deal with the large number of issues that sort of were arrayed against them when they tried to get inside Ukraine. So similar the issue with China. While there is a great amount of perceived strength, when it's covered, China has, Asif had covered it in his introduction, the second largest military in the world. Am I right, Asif? So you can have, and you can say, yes, we have the second largest military strength in the world in terms of numbers, though we are no less. But what can China actually bring to the battlefield? That is an issue. That is one issue that has to be taken into consideration. Secondly is, what is the ability of the Chinese Air Force to actually operate at altitudes above 15,000 feet? They have 7 airfields in Tibet, but their payload capacities are severely depleted. And the other issue to be noticed is that the Chinese mainland from Tibet, from the place where they are now deployed against us, is about 2,000 kilometers away. So where do these aircraft take off from? Where do they bring the weapon systems to? And how do they feel they're going to wage war against us? So what I basically want to say is that if you were to take one, as I'm talking as a military man, because there is no end to geographical issues, there's no end to us, bringing on thought processes, saying these are the issues that Chinese have, these are the capabilities that they have. But when we've seen them on the battlefield, when we've seen them on in Ladakh, or when we've seen them in Arunachal, which they claim completely, there has been no significant capability of the PLA to win any kind of encounter with us. So in terms of numbers, yes, she might have a larger army, but in terms of numbers that she can bring to the battlefield, she doesn't have a significant advantage. In terms of her air force, yes, she might have a larger number of aircraft, but in terms of the ability of those aircraft to operate above 15,000 feet, or to utilize their payloads, is significantly reduced. India has a much lesser distance to cover with her aircraft, and therefore we don't have this kind of disadvantage that China has. Weapon systems, technical weapon systems, a large number of weapon systems are actually demonstration weapons. She can have high energy weapons, she can have laser weapons. These are demonstrated capabilities which are meant for probably demonstration. But can the PLA really fight us? That's a question that we continuously war game with ourselves, that if she was to come and finally there was to be a problem with us, how would China fight this war? And once we've sort of war gamed these issues, we've realized that there's no larger advantage that China has displayed that we need to be really very worried about. Even as per the measures of the capital intensive militaries, such as military expenditures, China is far ahead. But these figures don't really account for the expenditures on wages and pensions, which makes it really difficult for us to assess how modern the two militaries really are. This is the main issue that I want to sort of convey, is that while there is this large disinformation situation, much like how the Russians had in terms of tanks, the asymmetry of the Russian army in Ukraine, but they were unable to capture Kyiv. They were unable to even reach Kyiv. And in the end, final analysis, they're fighting in the 4 regions which they have actually taken. So similarly, I feel that there are no large advantages that the PLA can accrue against us. Now, if in a land situation, there are no large advantages, then what are the advantages that China might have on the Indian Ocean? What can she bring to us on the Indian Ocean, military-wise? I'm not talking of the trade, I'm not talking of economics, I'm not talking of those issues at all. But on the Indian Ocean, India has a far, far larger advantage. The Indian Navy, after all, it's named after India, the Indian Ocean. We have a huge deployment of ships along our coastlines. The Indian Ocean is along our coastline. We are fighting from our own mainland. We have the islands of Nicobar. We have the islands of, we have our island territories, which are actually, in many ways, huge aircraft carriers, unsinkable aircraft carriers. And we have a large deployment of forces. We are building that further up to ensure that at no point can we be, can this asymmetry be so large that we will just have to fold. So what I really want to say is that while we understand the issue about China, the world can stand up to the bully. We now have foreign policy, we have the Quad, the Indian diplomats, the Americans, the Japanese, and Australia have created the Quad. Though Quad at present may be just talking shop, but we've started the first military exercise between the Quad. That's a great first advantage. The 4 militaries are getting to know each other. We're getting to operate with each other. And I feel that in the next 4 to 5 years, there will be significant interoperability advantages that these 4 countries would be able to bring against, in case China does decide that she can bring military might against any one of us. She doesn't have any major advantages coming out of the South China Sea. There is Indonesia, there is Vietnam, there is Cambodia, there is Laos. There are all the countries there where the Chinese ships have to actually push through, which is the reason why the Chinese developed the port of Gwadar in Pakistan, which would give it access to the Indian Ocean. So all in all, what I really want to say is that we're not looking for a future conflict. We are hoping that if China would understand the advantages of being a friend of India. India brings significant amount of economic prowess, significant amount of trained manpower, significantly good economy, and we're among the world's greatest, fastest growing economies of the century. And the geographic advantages that India upholds over China would be significantly amplified with American support from New Delhi. It is important to note that future military conflict is not a preordained event, as both India and China have commendable records on resolving territorial disputes in a manner that is acceptable to different claimants. A crucial advantage or challenge in the months and years ahead would be the willingness of the Chinese to negotiate a satisfactory border agreement. We've recently had an agreement with them to further move our troops away, at least 1 kilometer away from each other, further reducing the chances of a conflict. In 2 of the 6 disputed areas that we had brought up with them, in Hot Springs and in Galwan, we moved away a little bit. We are still close in 1 or 2 more places, but I'm certain that with a little more time, we will be able to resolve these issues. So what is important is also that the areas or the countries on India's periphery. Let me start with Nepal, Bhutan, Myanmar, Burma, that China sort of borders. Nepal, though, has a certain number of agreements. She's a part of the BRI, but I know for certain that Nepal will not allow the PLA to come inside and will not allow the PLA to cross into Nepalese territory. I have gone to Nepal. As I've read out part of my biodata, I was posted in the Indian Embassy in Nepal as the military advisor. And I'm absolutely certain that Nepal would not allow the Chinese to cross, not allow the PLA to bring in troops there. Similarly with Bhutan, there is a large and a great suspicion of the Chinese intent. Anyway, bringing in troops from the Doklam Valley into Bhutan is a very difficult process because the mountains are very difficult to sort of cross. So that also will not give it any significant advantage. Now the issue about Myanmar or Burma. I had personally gone to Burma a couple of years back, spoken to the leadership, and they're absolutely clear that they do not and will not support any kind of or allow any kind of Chinese movement inside Myanmar. At any rate, bringing in the military through Myanmar into India is an extremely difficult process. The Japanese could do it in the Second World War, but for the Chinese to do it now, through extremely difficult terrain, through different kinds of tribes that inhabit those areas, Chinese would find it very difficult to come inside. So all in all, there is a perception, there's a perceived threat, and there is an actual threat, and there's an actual capability. I think we can stand on our own, and we can we have enough on the table to deter the Chinese from any kind of situation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lieutenant General Sokin Chauhan, speaking from New Delhi, who has explained extensive about the perspective Indian on rising of China power, particularly on border issue, around China. And this is very important for us to discuss it later about the China attitude, which is growing, and we call it the aggressive attitude of China toward the neighbors. Let's see now the next distinguished speaker, Professor Carlyle Thayer with us. Please allow me to introduce Professor, the short biography. Speaking from Canberra, I believe, Professor Carlyle Thayer is Emeritus Professor of Politics at the University of New South Wales School of Humanity and Social Sciences. He is currently Director of Thayer Consultancy, Small Business Register in Australia in 2002, that provide political analysis of current regional security issues and other research support to selected clients. Professor Thayer was educated at Brown University of the United States. He held master's degree in Southeast Asian Studies from Yale University and PhD in International Relations from Australian National University. Please welcome Professor for presentation on the topic about the China 73 years anniversary of China's government. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. And I'd like to thank the Center for Southeast Asian Studies Indonesia for inviting me. I'm taking a broad strategic view, and I put China under Xi Jinping, a global power and a regional hegemon by 2049 as his aspirational goals. And in my presentation, I'd like to examine that. Next slide, please. So my outline is to look at Xi Jinping and in 2016, his Great China Dream, what that entails, just on the eve of the 20th Party Congress, which will give him a third term. And then I break that, what does Xi Jinping want? And it's a first-class military, economic growth, continental security, control over the first island chain, reunification with Taiwan, domination in the South China Sea, and to become a global power. And I'll critique or present that view in the paper and offer some conclusions. Next slide, please. So Xi Jinping and his China dream is based, if we look at the picture on the left, the imperial powers, including Russia back then, and Japan, carving up China like a melon in the 18th century, each taking spheres of influence. So it was a century of humiliation, and Xi Jinping milks the concept that China is the victim today. And he's promising the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation in speeches on National Day just now. It's a view, and the war in Ukraine sort of challenges that. I'll come back to that at the very end, that the East is rising and the West is in decline. This is China's moment. And in his National Day speech on the 1st of October this year, to achieve great dreams, you must have a great struggle. And then on the 16th of October, the 20th Congress of the Chinese Communist Party, since term limits were eliminated, will choose him for the third and perhaps inevitable fourth or whatever term for life as president of China. Next slide, please. Now, what does he aspire to? Now, I have presented these points before to CSEAS Indonesia, and they're based on Chatham House rules. And my source is a very senior individual who's held high-level offices in his government, who's fluent in Chinese and has been there more than 100 times. And so these are his, I'm elaborating on them, but that's my interpretation, because that night I could only take hand notes, but not get a copy. So obviously the first, and we're seeing that, is to keep the Chinese Communist Party in power and Xi Jinping as the leader in the core in power. Maintain national unity and territorial integrity. That's the Uyghur separate, so-called separatists, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and the four Shahs, which Bob Beckman talked about, the Prattas, Macclesfield, Paracels, and Spratlys. Develop the economy to avoid a middle income track, protect the environment so growth can continue. Next slide. To develop a first-class military that's peer to the US, push the US back from the first island chain, get continental security on the mainland, and so Bob Beckman brought to our attention the Great Wall and China's historic preoccupation with land threats, not just from Mongolia, but from Eurasia, I would add. And this is seen in the Belt and Road Initiative. Grow markets along this and have a gravitational pull towards Beijing. And the recent meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization with all the stans, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, etc., and their concerns about being attacked by an outside country are illustrative of China's drive under Xi for continental security. And then at the end, it's become a global power with China at the center of the international system. And then beneath that system, concentric sets of interest, and become a shaper of the new rules-based international order. It's not the elimination of the United States, but it's to elbow China's way to the top and be able to dominate in that way. So now I'll address these, and then I'm reshuffling them, which into my mind is my logical order. Next slide, please. So the first-class military. And here we see on the anniversary in July this year, the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party, we will elevate our people's armed forces. Now, unfortunately, here we go. Okay. We will elevate our people's armed forces to world-class standards so that we are equipped with greater capacity and more reliable means for safeguarding our national sovereignty, security, and development. Now, without going into great detail, we can do that in question and answer, and relying on US commanders of the Indo-Pacific Command, they have asserted for several years now that China has a quantitative lead over the United States. Larger numbers of aircrafts, not larger numbers of ships. But the previous presentation, we have the perceived capability and the actual. So that was a good segue into this. And China is rapidly closing the qualitative gap in technology and system of systems that we're going. So it's to be a peer with the United States by 2049. Next slide. On economic development here, the chairman, moderator, in introducing us, told us the second largest economy in the world, biggest trading partner, et cetera. That's all true. But when I decided to fill this in, and of course the Chatham House thing I attended was a year ago, we now have a weakness for China. Its economic growth, projected this year at 2.8%, will be lower than the rest of Asia minus China, which will grow at 5.3%. This is the first time since 1990 that countries in Asia have grown faster than China itself. That's due in part to Xi Jinping's zero COVID policy, locks down and travel restrictions, and the meltdown in China of the world's largest property market itself. So we have that. And as a result of all this, industrial growth is declining in China, rising unemployment. And one of the property markets, and this is a long-term trend that will affect them, the registered marriages have declined, birth rates are dropping, and there will be a gap as China ages as to who's going to replace that aging generation, my age and above. And the currency, the renminbi, is at the weakest level at the moment since the Asian financial crisis. And on our front page, our treasurer is predicting a possible world recession. And if China can't export and grow, then some of their goals will be much more difficult to obtain. But then it'll affect all our economies as well. Next slide, please. So continental security, and I think this is important, and Bob Beckman picked up on that, but it's really looking over to the extreme left-hand side, on the Western side, China and Central Asia. And I don't want to dwell on that, but in other words, China needs continental security. Historically, that's been in the past, the threats from Mongolia in the north, and China taking the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, really, and getting that cluster of states, which is touching on a Russian sphere of influence. And there may be interest there, but also that prior to the war in Ukraine, China hoped to extend the communication networks, rail and other things through Europe, and including through the Ukraine itself. And it needs that trade with Europe to sustain its own economy. So the war in Ukraine is interrupting that. But nonetheless, China still has that preoccupation with continental security that we shouldn't ignore. Next slide. So we move from land to sea, and that's the first island chain. And we have a similar map that Bob put up. I've just been to a major seminar in Malaysia, sponsored by Oxford University, on the first island chain historically. And there are real problems in translation from Chinese to English, and that the Pentagon in 2006 for the first time defined that as anti-access aerial denial. That's a Pentagon term, meaning that an area since the Second World War up until then was free go for the US, but now it could be contested, where China refers it to counter intervention strategy. But I'm going to dwell a little bit on this next slide. Relying on views of those who can read Chinese and not myself, of Chinese strategists, how do they view the first island chain, area denial access, meaning to constrict the US 7th Fleet. But from the view of the Chinese strategists, its eastern seaboard is hemmed in by a chain of offshore islands that constitute a physical barrier. And I think that came out of Bob's presentation as well. And these islands, Japan, Okinawa, are a base for strategic encirclement of China by hostile forces. And China is dependent, again, from Bob, talk on sea lines of communication, the trade routes, the resources, the fishery, hydrocarbons inside this island chain. And the island chain are geographic features that then have so far defined the operational scope of Chinese naval activities. It needs to break out of them to get to the Pacific. Otherwise, it's hemmed in. And these sea lines have been, Bob used the word choke points, but interdicted. The Malacca, so-called Malacca dilemma. But when you look at that island chain, and then when you get to the Philippines, well, now it's shifting back in the American alliance. But down as it hooks around, you don't find Indonesia, the Sunda, or parts of Malaysia, Vietnam being part of that chain. So from a Chinese strategist point of view, the key is Taiwan. You recover Taiwan, you now have a door that opens on the Pacific that can't be blocked by Japan and can't be blocked by the US and the Philippines. So that heightens the value of Taiwan, not just for emotional, historic reasons that it should be reunited with the mainland. Next slide, please. And so here's an example that and I'm wanting to focus the legends on the extreme right are in black, US, Russia, China, the number of operational ballistic missile submarines in black, the ones online and to come white. But in other words, but for China, and I really am looking only at the South China Sea, but you can see further. But on Hainan Island is where China has put most of its attack and ballistic missile submarines. And they can, by expelling the US from the South China Sea, deep water trench off Manila on the West Coast, have a bastion. But they're most important if they can get out in the Pacific and disperse and hide from the United States. Then China can deter a US first strike on mainland China, because the US, once it has done that, would suffer damage by these submarines firing back, which can't be found. That's the triad, is land, sea, and air, and dispersed forces in the Pacific would suit China's grand strategy of having an assured second means. And so China is rapidly building up its submarine force. I won't have Indonesia, Malaysia are quite concerned that Australia getting nuclear powered submarines. Just look at the number that China's creating. Anyway, next slide. And then Taiwan Unification. Now, the CI deputy director spoke in September, and Xi Jinping, according to their sources, has ordered the country's military to develop the capability to take control of Taiwan by 2027. But importantly, the intelligence community generally agrees that Xi Jinping would prefer to do that through non-military means, but he wants that option. And therefore, when Nancy Pelosi went and they conducted these military exercises all around Taiwan, they were demonstrating a nascent capability to isolate Taiwan in a conflict and bring it in its fold. They released a Taiwan paper, which basically used the model at the end of the Civil War. You totally surround the Kuomintang forces with absolute power. You threaten them and you gut surrender. And they say, we use that model to end the Civil War in other urban areas. We will apply it against Taiwan. And then, to the notes section, I could quote extensively, but here, I mean, it's this bluster. It's not as bad as Putin threatening atomic weapons, but only when China is completely reunified can there be enduring peace across the Taiwan Strait. And any move to obstruct China's unification is bound to be crushed by the wheels of history. So these threats to the US to back off. Next slide, please. Now, part of the guidance was, and I hope others address it, the suppression of the Uyghurs, Hong Kong, etc. I just dropped that the National Security Law in 2020 was used to crush the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong. But what I've experienced, because I watched it on TV, is that the Chinese ambassador in Canberra gave a speech to the National Press Club. And at the end, he was questioned. He was questioned about remarks just before he spoke, that week, by the Chinese ambassador in France that said that after reunification of Taiwan and the mainland, we'll do re-education. And then when the Chinese ambassador in Canberra was asked, what do you think about that? He goes, my personal understanding is that once Taiwan is reunited, coming back to the motherland, there might be a process for the people in Taiwan to have a correct understanding of China about the motherland. So we have to take the cases of the Uyghurs and the Hong Kong democracy movement to say, if Taiwan went, all those forces that have supported and participated in democratic elections on Taiwan that cannot accept Chinese communist rule are destined for re-education camps. And that's just an appalling situation in my view. Next slide, please. On the South China Sea, I've already mentioned historic claims to the foreshaws. And what I want to get on, there are all kinds of reasons why China has its interest. It's the bottom one that I'm saying trumps everything. So yes, there's this feeling that in the past China, we were the first to discover, name, and occupy these features, and bad imperialists have taken them away from us. They have vital shipping routes in which China's depend, so China has national interest. There are marine resources, fisheries, hydrocarbons, minerals on the seafloor, and Bob detailed that, and making China have the same interests as other maritime powers. But to me, it is the potential bastion for nuclear submarines, attack submarines, and ballistic missile submarines that is absolutely key and crucial, because it's the very essence of survival in a nuclear world. In other words, Russia can bluff about using nuclear weapons in Europe. Do we call it and have World War III? And for China, even though it could do tremendous damage against the US, by building up, it could, against a potential Russian threat in the long-term future, or the United States today, disarm that threat because of its ability to counterattack. So the South China Sea has that strategic importance underlaid with all these other claims as well. Next slide. Now, finally, in this litany, a global power. China will become the largest and most powerful country in the world on a par with the United States, is what Xi Jinping aspires to. Its economy is growing there, forgetting the hiccups or obstacles that I've just mentioned. On a par with the United States, not excluding it, but in the Asia-Pacific, as distinct from Indo-Pacific, China will be the dominant power. It's a zero-sum game. China is working to expel the US in its influence and break up US alliances, because it doesn't believe America has enduring interest in the region. China will set the rules to serve its interest. And one very brief example, take human rights. The US and the West focus on human and political rights. China says it's the right to develop the economy, to alleviate poverty, to control COVID. Those are the rights that need to be respected, and the right of a country's sovereignty to be protected by threats. And the China model is not to be exported. That's what China does. And it's for other countries to understand it and pick and choose as elements of it are exported. But China will work with anybody in any country, Hun Sen's Cambodia, if it cooperates with China. So China isn't forcing it to become like China. But the China model is to export technical standards along the Belt and Road, for example, that would exclude the US and the West that don't meet those standards. Huawei and the 5G network would be an example. And in governance and political values. And I mentioned the human rights situation, economic outcome and material well-being trump political and civil rights itself. So there's the China model that they extol, but they don't force on other countries. They're pragmatic, but bits and pieces can be borrowed. Next slide. I now move into my conclusion on the challenges and problems. US-China competition is going to intensify, and that will be the main driver affecting security in the Asia-Pacific. There'll be competition on trade, economic relations, technology, value, supply chains, political values, and the military. And we're seeing Chinese buzzing American aircraft and using lasers on Australian and American military aircraft. Taiwan reunification will be the focal point of US-China tensions. The US is bound by the Taiwan Relations Act to come to assistance, and it seems to be a bipartisan position in Washington. We haven't mentioned ASEAN. It's a major challenge to its cohesion, unity, and centrality. ASEAN can keep meaning, and the big elephants will keep pushing and shoving and trampling the grass as they proceed. Individual states in ASEAN will come under pressure to take sides or not take sides, and China is likely to use economic sanctions, as they have against Australia, by countries that stand up to China. Next slide. China's drive for a first-class military will lead to increased arms expenditures, as they are already occurring in the region. COVID hasn't dampened them. And AUKUS will become a counterpoint to China, because as China attempts to bridge that technological gap, there will be a boost by the US, UK, and Australia to make that a goal for China much more difficult. It's taking three heavy modern economies with special characteristics to develop that. Now, China's declining economic growth will impact on both global and regional economies, affect Indonesia, affect Australia, affect everybody. We need a good global economy so that we can trade and sell secure supply lines. Restrictions on BRI, Belt and Road Infrastructure Initiative funding is already evident. Continental security is leading to a creation of Eurasian bloc, where China is displacing Russia in Central Asia itself. And the war in Ukraine will constrain Russia from playing an active role until that conflict is resolved. Last slide, please. China will continue to push for an exclusionary code of conduct in the South China Sea. No military exercises, no foreign oil companies to be involved. It will maintain its Coast Guard maritime militia presence in the sea and waters claimed by the littoral states, and interfere when they attempt to contract with foreign oil companies and exploration ships. China will continue to challenge US and allied overflights and warship. They've increased in intensity, and they've increased in provocation with the use of military-grade lasers. And China will, and that was the central strategic point here, develop the land and sea-based nuclear triad, and the South China Sea is important for that sea-based triad. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Clyde Taylor, speaking from Canberra, Australia, who has explained the growing of China's power in the world. Unfortunately, is not always bring good changes, good benefit from around the neighborings. Particularly if you look at the Charles Taylor presentation about the Taiwan 2027 is quite deadline for United of China. Or let's now go to the New Delhi again to see Mr. Kalpit Mankikar. I would like to introduce the next speaker, speaking from New Delhi, India. Mr. Kalpit Mankikar is a fellow with Strategic Studies Program and is based out of Observer Research Foundation, Delhi Center. His research focuses on China, specifically looking at its rise and domestic politics. And Mr. Kalpit has written extensively for the International Business Times of India, Swar Java Magazine, India-China Business Chronicle, among others. He was selected for the Kautilya Fellowship in 2020. That is some of information regarding Mr. Kalpit Mankikar. Please welcome for the presentation.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. And am I audible now?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
So I'll just start with sharing some of my slides. Just give me a minute. Yes. So I'd like to I'd like to thank the Center for Southeast Asian Studies and Dr. Anjaya for this opportunity to present my views on the dynamics of mainland China and Hong Kong. Now, it's a really vast topic, and since we have about 15 to 20 minutes at our disposal, I'd like to explore some of the major contours of this relationship. They are the ties between the People's Republic of China and Hong Kong. What are the factors that have really influenced the dynamics of this relationship and the political trends? So, to start with, let's kind of rewind slightly to the decade of the 80s and the 90s, and let's see the kind of circumstances, the kind of events that happened at that point of time. How did they impact today's situation, or is there really a link between that? So, in the decade of the 80s and 90s in China, we saw a rise of nationalism. Now, this was communists world over, speak of creating a new order, creating a new social order, a new worldview. But this was really harking back to a sort of a glorious past. Now, in the 1980s, when Deng Xiaoping was consolidating his reign really on China, one of the chief priorities of China became national reunification. I think some of my speakers earlier had touched upon this, that China had really lost out on some of its territories under the Qing dynasty, and that it was really important to redeem these lost territories. Now, what Deng Xiaoping really had in mind was the reunification of Taiwan, which again people have touched upon. So, Deng Xiaoping has this discussion with some of the US senators in the 80s, and a description of this is in Richard Evans' book on Deng Xiaoping. So he really talks about how Taiwan can really have its social and economic system and even its armed forces. So China is not really interested in disturbing any of the local leadership, any of the political leadership. China has certain constraints as far as its own people and its own systems goes. So given that in mind, China would rather concede Taiwan to have a certain, a certain kind of a way of life. So now this is really encompassed in the whole vision of one country, two systems. Now, what happens ahead is a little interesting. In 1989, the Communist Party is really challenged by a bunch of students who, troop into the Tiananmen Square. And what really riles the Communist Party is students, having this figurine of the Statue of Liberty, which for many people in the Communist Party then represented a certain worldview. It was not just a figurine, but it was a worldview of the West, of America, of capitalism. And of course, there was a reaction from the Communist Party, and the protesters were brutally dealt with. But the underlying issue that the students raised was about political reform. Now, this is seen by the Communist Party as a very, very dangerous proposition, because obviously, if you have political reform, and that would only mean, it could mean that the Communist Party could be voted out of power if you had democratic elections. Now, obviously, Deng Xiaoping said, the central thesis of his political ideology was that we can have economic liberalization, but under the overarching umbrella or the overarching control of the Communist Party. Now, how does the Communist Party at that point of time react to this? Now, one of the things the Communist Party does is introduce what is called as the Patriotic Education Campaign. Now, this is basically a state-sponsored educational course content wherein you try to instill values of discipline, you try to instill values of nationalism. Now, one of the narratives that this patriotic education campaign sparked off or created was that China had been humiliated in the past, and this humiliation really went on for about 100 years, which was only kind of halted by Mao Zedong standing on the podium in 1949, October 1st of October, and proclaiming it to be a people's republic. Now, the Communist Party told its people that, listen, especially the youth, they were addressing the youth, that, you've had a good time. We've started this economic liberalization, but I don't think you can forget or you can lose sight of the fact that we have another mission in mind. We have to recover those territories that were colonized by the West, and that it is your bounden duty to recover these territories. Now, in that kind of a milieu, in that kind of a circumstance, in the mid-90s, around 1997, the United Kingdom then hands over Hong Kong to China because, of course, the lease got over. But the Chinese narrative of this is that this is, again, the first step towards national reunification and the first step towards, getting back bigger places like Taiwan. But here is where we can experiment with the whole philosophy of one country, two systems. Now, again, it's, of course, there was euphoria in China regarding this, but there was also euphoria in Hong Kong. So entire generation of, a section of people who had never lived under communist rule really were celebrating that, now they're, they saw that they were a part of a larger, a larger nation, and, they were kind of meeting back with their compatriots, the Tongbao. So there was this whole euphoria on both sides. Now, this euphoria again was really, really short-lived. So very soon, Beijing has to start dealing with the city of protests, as it were. So, of course, this is not a comprehensive timeline of the protests that have rocked Hong Kong, but I think it's very important to note that in 2005, a few years after the reunification or after the handover of Hong Kong to China, there are protests, and they basically seek that the chief executive, that is the highest political office in Hong Kong, that person be elected by a popular mandate. There has to be a universal franchise for this. There is also a demand that the kind of special interest groups that have a bearing on the district councils be abolished, and instead of that, you have a kind of a direct election. Now, that is another few years in 2011. There is the whole Occupy Hong Kong movement. Of course, it was a part of the larger movement, but it also highlights issues like social inequality and economic disparity in Hong Kong. Now, moving on from that is the 2012 the Kong Chitong movement incident. Sorry. Now, Kong Chitong was a professor at Peking University, and he uses a very unparliamentary word to describe people in Hong Kong. I do not wish to repeat it, but he uses a very unparliamentary word to describe people in Hong Kong. At the same time, there is really a survey that is published by China, and it says that people in Hong Kong really consider themselves to be superior to the mainland Chinese, and they kind of they ride roughshod on them. So at this point of time, there is some amount of tension between people who, the mainlanders who moved to Hong Kong and the ethnic Hong Kongers. Now, a few years later, in 2014, there are again protests that erupt because the Chinese parliament has this whole idea that it needs to pre-screen candidates, it needs to veto or has to have a security veto for candidates who aspire to be the chief executive. Now, it is from this event that things from now on get a little complicated for Hong Kong. So again, follow up to that is the crackdown on unlicensed street vendors, and following which there are, that is called as the Mongkok unrest. Now, following this, there's a huge crackdown on people in Hong Kong, on some of the people who protest who go ahead and protest. And at this point of time, the Chinese Association for Hong Kong and Macau Studies very forceful projects that Hong Kong needs to have a national security law, because there are elements here that are hell-bent on disturbing the peace and sanctity of Hong Kong. So we have to remember these markers that were already there, the straws in the wind. Now, again, moving back a 3 years later, you have the anti-extradition law protests. And in effect, what this would have done is, if it would have been passed by Hong Kong, the criminal suspects, or suspects in the criminal trials would be, in effect, could stand trial on the mainland under Chinese law. Now, this thing is seen as something that slowly, the whole concept of one country, two systems is being eroded. Also, Hong Kongers see a pattern in this entire exercise. The pattern is that with every successive protest, because obviously Beijing does not have a kind of a protocol to really deal with these protests, that every protest is really put down by brute force, and somehow Beijing or the mainland is trying to subsume the whole identity, the whole the being of Hong Kong, as it were. Now, again, were there larger fears to this? Now, one of the fears that Hong Kongers expressed was that the one-way permit. Now, the one-way permit was devised as a scheme in which mainlanders could reunite with their kin on the island. Now, if you see, there is a statistics in between 1997 to 2019, about 1 million people from the mainland entered Hong Kong. And if you segregate the rise in population of Hong Kong according to different headers, you will find that under this header, the influx into Hong Kong has increased by about 90%. So that was one of the biggest fears, that they were being swamped in. Now, again, there was another fear that, of course, there were cultural relations between Hong Kong and the island. So there was also a fear that the mainland was trying to change the demography of the island through marriages. Now, this is very contentious, but what does the data say on this? So in 1996, just about 1 year before the handover of Hong Kong, if you see the marriages that were registered on the mainland between people from the mainland, the marriages that were registered in Hong Kong between people on the mainland and Hong Kongers, they were about 7% of the total marriages registered. Now, just cut to 2018, and this figure of the marriages that were registered between mainlanders and Hong Kong on the island rose to about 33%. Now, they were more than 33%. So this was the kind of fear. There was another fear that this was more of a cultural, or this was more of a temporal integration with the mainland. But again, the fear was also of physical links with the mainland, which would erode the very basis of the one country, two systems. So in 2018, the high-speed railway that China has Hong Kong was linked to that, to the high-speed railway. Again, a year later, you have the longest sea bridge in China. So the sea bridge between Guangdong, from Zhuhai to in Guangdong to Hong Kong and Macau, a sea bridge was opened. So this was also seen by people in Hong Kong, that there is a, a definite kind of a push to integrate Hong Kong with the mainland. Now, that was also again one of the reasons why you had protests in recent years seeking greater political freedom. And of course, that was the response of Hong Kongers. Now, again, another response of Hong Kongers, which caused considerable consternation for the CCP, for the Communist Party, was the rise of identity politics in Hong Kong. So surveys after surveys were being conducted in Hong Kong about how Hong Kongers really perceived themselves. So the University of Hong Kong conducted a survey in 2018, and only about 11% of the respondents said identified themselves as Chinese. And 53% of this was an overwhelming sum. 53% of the respondents said that they were Hong Kongers. Many of them identified themselves as Asian, as global citizens. So, and this was at its highest. So the 11% of respondents who identified themselves as Chinese was probably the lowest tally, and the 53% was the highest tally. So this really created doubts in the minds of the Chinese as to where were things really headed to for them. Now, again, China's response to this has been on predictable lines. So some of the speakers previous to me touched upon this. They said that we can't have the stability of the city being disrupted. Also, Xi Jinping was gearing up towards his, this year, if all goes well, in fact, this month, he will get his third term. Now, Xi Jinping could not look as a weak leader. And that is probably one of the reasons why the National Security Law of 2020 was almost steamrolled into Hong Kong at midnight. Now, this is a law that I'm sure people know of this, but just to recap it for my audience, it is a law that really proscribes acts of what the CCP describes as secessionism and terrorism. If you flout this law, if you're convicted under this law, you can get a maximum life sentence. Again, the guilty, some of them are maybe, if you're found guilty, you may be debarred from public office. Some of the suspects in criminal trials can also be hauled up in court on a mainland. And the fear really is that many of these are closed door trials, so you don't really know what goes on in this. And now the impact of this has been that protesters, activists, lawyers, lawmakers have been arrested, and it has to some extent damaged the credibility of Hong Kong, because you've had two Supreme Court judges who used to serve. Hong Kong had this tradition of having people from other nationalities serve on the highest judicial bench in the country. And it became untenable for Western democracies because, on one hand, you were criticizing them, and on the other hand, it was being pointed out to them that, the judges were, your jurists are serving on them. So this became really untenable, and the two judges of the UK Supreme Court had to pull out of to sit on the Hong Kong bench. Of course, there is a famous case of crushing of dissent. Apple Daily owner and the entire staff has been arrested for under the National Security Law. Also, another follow-up, or the way Hong Kong or the way Beijing handled this, was the reforms to the electoral law that were brought in. So a screening committee really sat to vet candidates, and the criteria was really patriotism. Now, many of the viewers, many of the people think that this is something which is new, but jog back to that conversation that Deng Xiaoping had with a delegation from Hong Kong in June 1984, where he said that in future, the administration of Hong Kong should really be in the hands of patriots. And when he said patriots, he said, you might be a Hong Konger, you might have lived in Hong Kong, but it's important that you have to love the motherland. And basically by motherland, he meant the Communist Party. So somebody who kind of kowtows to the Communist Party is their idea of a patriot. So now, lastly, I think it's very important to understand what is the kind of impact that this has had on Hong Kong. Now, this year you had Xi Jinping visiting Hong Kong. This was his, if you consider it overseas territory, this was his first trip outside of the mainland. So in July this year, Xi Jinping goes to Hong Kong and he says that nobody, especially the young generation, the generation next of Hong Kong has no reason to now fear, because the worst is over. We've transited from a situation of chaos to a situation of order. But how does data kind of blow holes in this whole narrative of Xi Jinping's claims? So if you just take the case of Canada. So Canada granted about 3,400 permanent residencies last year to people from Hong Kong. Now compare that with what was there about a decade earlier. They granted only about 300 people Canadian permanent residencies. Now, if you study, the graphic is there. If you closely study the study and work permits that have been handed out in 2021, you realize that there are about 19,000 work permits and study permits that were handed out to Hong Kongers. Now, what was the amount only a few years ago? It was about 4,000. So this makes it a jump of nearly about 300%. Again, I leave it at that, and this is how Hong Kong is seeing the worst kind of a migration to Canada, and these are the levels that were there in the 1990s, and you can see that the same thing is repeating now. So I leave it at that. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much again, Mr. Kalkit Mankikar, speaking from New Delhi. I just want to greet the audience from YouTube also to have some question after Mr. Peramala Anjaya presentation. So we still have quite some time. And so please, Professor Robert Blackman, still with us. Thank you very much. We will have question and answer after Mr. Peramala Anjaya. Mr. Peramala, of course, is our senior research fellow, Center for Southeast Asian Studies, and journalist from Jakarta Post from 1995 to 2020. And I think he has a Master of Philosophy in Southeast Asia and Southwest Pacific Study from School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. Please welcome Pak Peramala for presentation.
Yeah, thank you very much, Pa Sep. Thank you very much. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah. Okay. Today's our topic is China turns 73 years. And what are the challenges and what are the issues which we are dealing with in our world. So actually on 1st of October 1949, Mao Zedong proclaimed the People's Republic of China. But we should know that since its birth, because it is a country ruled by the Communist Party of China, so we have been facing so many problems, so many challenges. Like even for example, in 1949, also before becoming the People's Republic of China, there was a long bloody civil war from 1927 to 1949 between the Chinese Communist Party and the Republic of China troops. Millions of people died. And also during the 1949, PRC annexed Second East Turkestan Republic, which we say now in Xinjiang area, and Tibet in 1950. Tibet, these two countries were independent countries, but they were annexed by this People's Republic of China. And in the 1960s also, we do have export of communist revolution to Indonesia, Malaysia, and other countries. So that's why we had a 1965 coup d'etat in Indonesia. So that's why Indonesia was able to suspend ties with China for so long. Next slide, please. Chinese political leaders, we will focus first to the Mao Zedong. Mao's rule was so brutal, and it was also because of its policies. There was a great famine, 1959 to 62, and there was also 10 years cultural revolution in which millions of people, Chinese people, were died. The doctrination of parties, ideology, and etc. So it all created a huge suffering during the Mao Zedong period. Next slide, please. Then we have 1970s. We have the rise of Deng Xiaoping, who introduced the market economic reforms and global engagement because the US-China ties were restored. And of course, at the same time, we had this terrible Tiananmen Square students protest in 1989. And as a result of that, the crushing of Tiananmen Square protest, and the Chinese Communist Party became stronger, and the Chinese economy also grew very fastly, and it became the world's second largest economy in 2010. Next slide, please. Then since 2012, we have a new president that is called Xi Jinping. Under his rule, the China has become more autocratic domestically and more aggressive abroad. So his first policy is the aggressive foreign policy, and he created his diplomats became wolf warriors. And also they have a military buildup, and they have coercing, bullying the South China Sea claimants, other claimants like Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, and even they didn't spare Indonesia, because they do claim a small portion of the North Natuna Sea. Then we do have problems with the freedom of navigation, and we do have Taiwan issue, and Senkaku Islands dispute with Japan, and disputes with India. Next slide, please. In 2013, China wants to become a global influencer. So that's why they started this Belt and Road Initiative. But actually, they want to invest $1 trillion in many countries in Europe, Asia, African countries. But the main intention is China has overcapacity and surplus capital. They want to invest in these countries in projects, infrastructure projects. But as a result, many countries ended up into its Chinese debt trap diplomacy. And the global domination of China is also increasingly felt in African countries. And also now, since Donald Trump period, China engaged tensions with the US and its allies. Next slide, please. Yeah, actually, as I said rightly, that under Xi Jinping's regime, Chinese government has become more autocratic in nature, because there is no freedom for Chinese people. There is no media freedom. There is no human rights. Tight controls on media, control of people's movements, because they have so sophisticated technology. facial recognition and tracking their online social media and other activities. And also we have this Uyghur issue, and we have also Tibetans also suffering. And also we have, as my previous speaker mentioned about the Hong Kong, how it changed because the one country, two systems has failed completely. So now we have only one system. Then we have this ruthless zero COVID-19 policies, and so many people were under lockdowns. Then one man rule of Xi Jinping, because he wants to become third term as the Chinese president during the 20th Party's National Congress, which will begin on October 16. And actually, this because of this, all these zero COVID policies, lockdowns, and the Chinese and Ukrainian war also contributed to the economic slowdown. Many people in China are facing many problems, like real estate has collapsed, and also banks also facing huge losses, and unemployment is rising, and also the old age people are growing, the number of old age people are growing. So these are all leading to economic slowdown. Next slide, please. Yeah, so actually the President Xi Jinping wants to become another Mao Zedong, because he wants to remain as a leader in the history of the Communist Party. With full powers. It is like a one party rule and one man rule. And China has become a problematic for the world, and also problematic for the Chinese people, because we have seen what is happening in Xinjiang, what is happening in Tibet, what is happening in Shanghai. Many cities, people are suffering a lot. So it is China is building its military in a large scale, and it is developing nuclear weapons and supersonic missiles. So it is becoming a very threat to the Asia and the world. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mr. Paramalanjaya, for very comprehensive, short and comprehensive about what is China becoming, internally becoming centralized, and globally increasing, rivalry with US will be very much influence the world. And now time for question and answer, but unfortunately we have already a list of questions. Please allow me to ask first, Professor Robert Blackman. You are still with us, Professor? Thank you very much for.
Yes, I'm still with you.
Okay, this is the question for you. Do you think that China will accept the rule of law in South China Sea?
Depends on what you mean by rule of law. With respect to disputes over sovereignty, there isn't any law. The only way to resolve the sovereignty disputes over islands is similar to what Malaysia and Indonesia did, or what Singapore and Malaysia did, is to go to a tribunal. But in East Asian disputes, whether it be between Japan and Korea or Japan and China, the disputes are far more sensitive, and the countries concerned are not likely to ever agree to take them to a neutral third party for resolution. So then the issue becomes, will China accept the Law of the Sea Convention as to how states can declare economic zones and claim resources? And again, it appears that China is making claims either based on the 4 Sha or about the 9-dash line, which challenge the provisions in the Law of the Sea Convention. So again, on these issues, my guess is there will continue to be a challenge. There will continue to be what we call lawfare between the US and its allies and some of the Southeast Asian claimants and China. How it is in the end resolved, I think it is too early to say. It depends in part on the COC negotiations. It depends on whether the Southeast Asian countries bordering the South China Sea are willing to accept what China seems to be insisting upon, or whether they challenge, and then how this leads. So to me, it's a slightly separate dispute than the big power dispute. It's a question of what the future relationship between China and its Southeast Asian neighbor.
So, and any others addition from, I think, Professor Caroline, about I think it's depend on what the rule of law is. You mentioned that China will have much power then, and then they create own rule. Is that the future of, in South China in particular, Professor Caroline? Would you mind to
You're muted.
to unmute first, please?
Right. Well, I recall China making a comment, I think within the last year, that the UNCLOS isn't the be all and end all of international law, without telling us what other law that they prefer. To be, trite here, it's law with Chinese characteristics. China is only going to follow that international law when it's in its interest. And I think, when you look at the code of conduct, there are many, many areas in there. The most important ones, its legal status, its enforceability, its geographic scope, that have not yet been covered. And, it's about 12% of the entire document has been finally approved, and it's all on principles. It's replete with references to UNCLOS international law, but that's, to me, meaningless. China just does not accept the claims of these other states. And it begins with that line that I've heard at countless conferences: we were the first to discover, name, and administer. These are all Chinese. And I was just reading a book on the Chinese Navy, and quite early after 1949, I think in the 50s, they sent the first boat to Zhengmu Reef, James Shoal, in Malaysia, to say that's the furthest part of China's territory. And we know that was a mistranslation from shoal to sandbank. Anyway, I'm agreeing with Bob. China, they'll work it out. China has negotiated its land borders, so that's often used as a prelude to, that China can settle boundary disputes with its neighbors. But in the sea, I think for the strategic reasons I'm talking about, as long as the U.S., its allies, Japan, are firm on that island chain, and now that the Ferdinand Marcos Jr. government seems to be cooperating more with the United States, it's going to be squatters' rights from China's concern. We occupy possessions 9/10 of the law, is an old American expression. Just by sitting there and occupying and sending their Coast Guard boats, they're impervious. No one can take China to court, to a tribunal. China would reject it. And in the end, the agreement, if they do reach it bilaterally with any country, it will be that unequal relationship where I think a country agrees to get relief, to stop the pressures. But at the moment, I don't see any resolution to how you follow the maritime claims you can make from land features, which is what I think, I don't want to put words in Bob's mouth, what we're getting at. We have a way to solve all this piecemeal by piecemeal, but China isn't going to do it because it's claiming much more and on a very different basis.
Could I have one more point? One to keep it. China, in one sense, is is training large numbers of people are getting PhDs in law from leading universities. I look at the law of the sea experts by contrast to the States, they're an endangered species. Right? There's hardly a law school that's now teaching. And the law of the sea experts we have, my age or older, longer. I think there's a difference that China has a direction of wanting to reinterpret or redevelop the law in its national interest. And perhaps the Western countries taking policy seriously as they perhaps should. You know, Australia is a little exception. It's the extra states in their universe.
Okay, thank you very much. Next question is for Mr. Peramala Anjaya, because you are located in Jakarta now. And as we know that 3 of ASEAN countries involved in some of the dispute borders, Vietnam, Brunei, and Malaysia, even though Indonesia has no explicitly, to settle the border problem, but this exists in North Natuna Sea. Mr. Peramala, what do you think? What should ASEAN do, to tame the China aggressive in South China Sea?
Yeah, thank you, Pa Asif. Actually, we have to see the basic thing, because all the claimants, including Indonesia, though it is not a claimant, they all signed and ratified the UNCLOS Treaty 1982. All they agreed and ratified. That means, according to the UNCLOS terms and regulations, every country has its own exclusive economic zone, and also territorial sea and continental shelf, as Professor Blackman mentioned very clearly. But the same China, which signed and ratified the UNCLOS treaty, cannot accept, because already the 2016 the international permanent court of arbitration declared that the China's 9-dash lines were illegal. It is against the UNCLOS basic principles. So that's why now Philippines is also declaring that it wants that PCA ruling must be implemented and respected. And also Vietnam is also looking towards that aspect. And also Indonesia is also forcing, Malaysia is also forcing. So all these countries must stick to the rule of law. That is the very important rule of law, because we have signed an agreement. So please implement that. Please respect that. If you don't want, if you should not have signed that UNCLOS treaty in the first place. So that's why the ASEAN unity is very important. ASEAN unity and centrality is very important. All countries must agree on the issue of respecting the international law. So that's why they demand for a code of conduct, as Professor Carl Thayer mentioned, that the code of conduct must be based on the rule of law, and also it should be a legally binding document, not like the previous DOC, which is not at all. Many times they violated the DOC. So this is the ASEAN unity is the key. ASEAN unity is the key, and they have to demand that you should sign the agreement, so you should respect the UNCLOS treaty. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Do you believe, Professor Blackman, that UNCLOS is a basis for ASEAN to settle the dispute with China and South China Sea?
Yeah, well, as I explained, the ASEAN states did not clarify islands until now with their joint to Continental Shelf Commission. I think one of the weaknesses that the Philippines brought the case without coordinating with the other ASEAN claimants, and therefore and I'm not sure who was not communicating with whom at the time, but also I think Indonesia always we are a claimant state. Well, that's true that you're not a claimant state. You don't claim sovereignty over disputed islands, but you have the same dispute with China, because China claims from the foreshell or the line intersects significantly with the economic and continental claims of Malaysia from of Indonesia from China. So you're in effect a party to the dispute with China over the legality of the China Sea. But I see very little that indicates that four countries are able to accept a united position or develop a united position. And I think that
Yes, Professor Taylor.
Yes, I just a minor footnote to all of this when we use the word ASEAN. The current negotiations between China and the ASEAN member states are under a guideline to implement the Declaration of Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea Working Group. When ASEAN drew up the draft guidelines, its point one was that ASEAN would meet together and have a common position and then meet with China. Several years went by, and when those guidelines were finally approved, there were only two changes. The caucus of getting together was dropped in ASEAN and replaced by just promoting dialogue. And the other change at the very end was that the members of the working group would report to their foreign ministers. So we're stuck because I'm told that even at those meetings, China insists that all countries voice their opinion. So there is no ASEAN group, and that means landlocked Laos or Cambodia gets called upon. And if you're working on consensus, that can be undermined. So we have to be careful. And then another kind of footnote, the Permanent Court of Arbitration served as the registry for these proceedings. I call it a legal motel. If you were driving and checked into a motel, then decided to write a letter to the editor of the Jakarta Post, you don't blame the motel for the letter, you blame the person that signed the letter. And in this particular case, the arbitral tribunal is ad hoc. It has no permanent basis. It expires after it hired the proceedings of the Permanent Court of Arbitration. Everything went out on its stationery, and it was given a registry number because all the documents are held later. The Permanent Court of Arbitration is not part of the UN system, and it's the Arbitral Tribunal Annex 7 of UNCLOS that heard it. And I just bring, just to clarify, because lots of people then say Permanent Court of Arbitration, which would have, the two parties would have to agree to go there, and China didn't agree.
Okay, thank you very much for
could I just, could I just reinforce a little bit what Carl said, is that the negotiations for the CSEAS are with the 10 states of ASEAN, but it's only Vietnam, Malaysia, Philippines, Brunei, and Indonesia that have a direct dispute with China over the claims to the resources. And with ASEAN, mentioned by consensus, so any of the 10 ASEAN countries can block any agreement on the COC, which so I've never been very optimistic that the COC negotiations are to resolve the underlying issues. But I may be a pessimist.
Realist.
Thank you very much. General Sokin Chauhan would add something about regarding the South China Sea and ASEAN and the other issues.
Yeah, I been hearing with great interest the issues about how China is being allowed to get away, flaunting and refusing to obey international conventions that she herself has signed. Why is the world permitting that? Why is the United Nations permitting that? Why is the ASEAN permitting that? Why aren't we having more noise about it? Are the ASEAN countries being bullied? Asif? It's easy for us to sort of agree to that, but we've seen the extent of bullying that China can do. And I'm sure Kalpit and Anjaya would agree with me that we've been a victim of China's bullying for a very long time. And she's doing that in Nepal, in the mountains. She's doing that with Bhutan. She's doing that with Myanmar. She's doing it everywhere, and on the South China Sea and along the Indian Ocean, and everywhere. Why are we permitting her to, to do this? Why can't we sort of get together? We are trying, but somewhere there is a conflict of interest, which I feel that as academics, and we have such brilliant academics on this panel here, as panelists, I would say that why don't we come out clearly and say that, look, thus far and no further. I said, sorry, I'm talking like a soldier because, I feel you're inviting me to this panel would be not for anything else, but what does a soldier view? Because what I'm clear about, gentlemen, what I'm absolutely clear about is there is a difference between a demonstrated ability of China to counter what the world is going to do or what the world can do. There's a difference. Do not take everything that China does at face value. Much of it is just that. It's just something to show the world. There is a lot of hollowness in China's capabilities. There's a great hollowness in our naval capabilities. There's a great hollowness in our missile capabilities. There's a great hollowness in her cyber capabilities. And she cannot take on the world. That I'm absolutely clear about. You cannot allow Xi Jinping to go further. We have to stop him in the next 3 to 4 years. Otherwise, she becomes dangerous. Thank you.
Just wanted to add to this. Now, if you may permit me, the general spoke about what China is up to, but I think the problem really is in trying to understand what China has done and given that pattern, what it can do. So I just wanted to elaborate on this, that when China was gobbling up large parts, or there was an exercise that wanted to transform the South China Sea into China's lake. The world was, I cannot put it in any other way, but the world was extremely, as the good general said, complacent to this. We took Xi Jinping's words to be the truth, and there was a sentiment that China will this is the last thing that it will kind of hanker for and no more. So I think we took China's word for it that we will stop at this. We also took China's word for that there will be no militarization of these islands, but all these solemn promises seem to have been broken, and I think it's very relevant for us to find and see the pattern in China's behavior and what it portends for the future. So that's it.
Thank you very much for the comments. This is the last topic for discussion. General Shokin Chauhan, maybe you have answer how now the problem is how to stop or how to contain of the China aggressiveness, whether in South China Sea, in the border of India, and any others parts of the world.
There are two issues here. One is what would we recommend we do, and secondly, how can we get together to stop her? Let's just talk of these two issues. Along the mountains, along the Himalayas, where she has huge claim lines against India, we are confident of stopping her. We would be very grateful for international help. Definitely not military assistance, because we're capable of holding on to China and not letting it cross over. But more than that, moral support would be fabulous. We are not the Indian Army or India of the early 60s. We are much more confident and much more capable today. And China knows that. And that is why she has not moved further. So that brought to, and that brought to something that I have studied the PLA on the PLA's reaction on the ground, because I've been a commander on the ground dealing with the PLA. Every time the Chinese tried to bully us, if you stood up to China and if you told the PLA you will not go through, the PLA did not attempt to go through. The PLA used coercion, used everything to push you without getting into an actual encounter. But if they ever encountered troops who were not willing to let the PLA through and were willing to stop them through bodily, through the body, keeping your weapons in hand and said, if you go through, I will fire. The PLA did not go through. I saw the same thing when I was commanding one of India's largest corps, and later on, I was also the Director General of the Assam Rifles, which is responsible for the Indo-Myanmar border, as well as my troops are also along the line of actual control with China. That every time we did not allow them, they did not go through. China waits and sees how far she can go. And that's what she's doing with us. That's what she's doing in South China Sea. That's what she's doing everywhere. And I feel the world is just too tired to try and, push back on these Chinese attempts. We're also a world that has gone through the Second World War. We don't want any more wars. And now there's Russia with Ukraine, and we are fed up with this conflict of nations wanting something more than what they've agreed to, or what international law has permitted us to have. There has to be, gentlemen, some kind of pushback, collective pushback against China. And I am absolutely convinced about it that unless the ASEAN, unless the Western countries, unless the Quad all get together and decide that we're not going to allow them to go through, she will not understand. And we should be prepared to deal with the China that might initiate military action. But there is great hollowness in China. There's both great hollowness in her equipment, great hollowness in her economy, great hollowness within the PLA itself. And she's hiding more than she has actually. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a response. Any participants to have about the China? I think the Australia has already clear Professor Blackman about the policy to encounter of China. Also, US also already stand up. And the key point of General Sokin is about the unities and do not the big power bully the neighbors. That is the keyword how to create.
I'm sorry, I'm just a very blunt person by nature.
Thank you very much. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your
there are no niceties when you deal with China. There are no niceties at all.
Right. Okay.
Sir, I think we should have a photo session. I think session.
This is, I think, the end. Before the end, I would be grateful for Jihan or Nirmala to have a photo session because we are end of the discussion webinar today. Please, Jihan.
Okay, Pak.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. 1, 2, 3. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much again.
Thank you,
on behalf of CSEAS, my name is
listening to
Setiawan
all
from
Thank
University
you all
of
very
Jakarta.
much.
I would like to thank
Thank
applause
you.
for us together.
Yeah.
See you in the next international webinar, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
General.
Thank you.